Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to give a presentation on some of my research that I've been doing. It's really a pleasure to talk with everyone about the conditions affecting EFL learners' hedge use in a line discussion forum. My name is Stachus Peter II, and I'm from Hiroshima Bunkyo University. So to set this scene, I'd like to just give some definitions first, and the first one is about hedges. So hedges function as mitigators, and so they mitigate directness by decreasing a certain quality of what an interactant says. This is according to Lakoff. There's a lot more authors that have written about hedges, but the most easy to understand one is by Lakoff. And they mitigate face-threatening acts in order to maintain relationships. This is by Spencer Oatley. In essence, hedges function as things that soften elements in conversation. So if you have an opinion, hedges tend to soften that quality. And so hedges are typically identified by finding a word or phrase that might be interchangeable or removable inside a sentence. And because of its quality of softening, it's able to make a statement seem less direct, etc. But we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So non-agreement is another definition that I like to talk about. It's talking particularly about statements that contain elements of disagreement, and disagreement is viewed negatively, according to Angori and Loker. So essentially, non-agreement is a term that includes neutral statements as well. It's anything that contains disagreement, which means that it doesn't need to be a statement that is completely disagreement or completely agreement. In fact, many studies up to this point have only focused on those two extreme ends. And so non-agreement is something that includes kind of everything that is from disagreement to something that involves a little bit of disagreement. So something that might have hedged agreement, for example, or hedged disagreement, I should say. And so we're looking at more of those more encompassing definitions right here. But it's basically everything that contains something that relates to disagreement. So the only thing it excludes is something that only has agreement. Closeness is another definition I'd like to talk about. And in essence, it is, as the term mentions closeness, it might seem very obvious what it is in the beginning. It's basically, how close you are with another person. And elements of it are that it's long-term and relatively resistant to the effects of daily occurrences. It's also an influencer of interactions and is reflected in the use of language. And so a lot of phenomena that you see related to changes between different types of relationships, either with a stranger or between a friend, obviously those are related to closeness. And so these are things that are expressed through language as well. And that's one of the focuses that we're looking at in this presentation. So the relationship that we're first, one of them is between non-agreement and hedge use. And so when we're looking at how many hedges interactants employ, it's important to consider whether the statement is agreement or non-agreement. That was one of the focuses. And so literature before has stated that disagreement is mitigated when it is needed. And so essentially you'll see a lot more hedge use in those statements. And in Japanese context in particular, Nozawa found that in conversations, there's a lot more hedge use in non-agreement. However, her study was a little bit limited by the fact that that type of disagreement was sort of role-played, kind of enforced disagreement. However, there was strong evidence that there is a lot more hedge use in even role-played disagreements. And it makes sense that, agreement, hedge use would occur more in order to prevent face-threatening acts from occurring. So face-threatening acts are elements that might damage the relationship between yourself and the other person. And softening the statement via hedge use is a great way to do that, especially when expressing disagreement, since it inherently contains face-threatening acts. So closeness and hedge use is the next relationship that I looked at. This was one of the most difficult ones because there's conflicting evidence. And so in the first point, we have Brown, Livingston, and Stephen, one obviously Brown Livingston from a long time before, and Stephen a little bit later on, but not so recent, in fact. Looking at what is the relationship between closeness and hedge use, and in fact they found that Brown Livingston first stated that there's more hedges being used between those who are distant, and Stephen and others who were with him found that there was a lot more hedge use between those who are distant as well, and so they kind of confirmed what Brown and Livingston said. However, a study 5 years before them found that there's a lot more politeness strategies between those who are close, in fact, and so perhaps in order to maintain a relationship, you're using more polite speech, and so there's conflicting evidence in this respect, and so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to look at what was the situation related to this, and whether or not there's anything that might influence this that perhaps previous research did not cover. So the research question that I looked at was twofold, which is what is the effect of non-agreement and closeness on learners' use of hedges in online discussion? So these two things, non-agreement and closeness, what effect do they have on hedges in an online discussion? So to summarize basically what the discussion was, it occurred on the Line smartphone application. It's one of the most popular smartphone messaging platforms in Japan. Students check it very frequently. All the participants were university students, and it was conducted in group discussions. So over a span of 8 weeks, students were conversing with each other on the smartphone app with their classmates, and they made discussion forum topics with one another, which were posted, and these topics were controversial in nature. So, for example, no smoking should be allowed on campus, or, for example, is money more important than love, and other very topics that are not very so you might have people on both sides of the spectrum, and so those were topics that students made and discussed on the forum. So to summarize what the participants' specs were, you have 59 first and second year university students. They came from 4 classes, C, D, E, and F. They consisted of 46 females and 13 males. Class C had 17 females and 4 males. Class D had 8 females and 2 males. Class E had 11 females and 1 male. Class F had 10 females and 6 males. Class C and D had a mean TOEIC score of 407, range of 225 to 840. Class E, there's no standardized English proficiency exam, so these were very low-level students. They had not taken any English proficiency exam in order to enter any English course or the university, but they were not English majors, so that kind of made sense. So Class F had a mean TOEIC score of 400 in a range of 255 to 605. So these were first-year students from Class F. So even though their mean TOEIC scores were lower than those from C and D, well, I shouldn't say lower, just a little bit lower, and in fact very similar. We considered C and D to be higher level because C and D were second-year students, and they had already taken 1 year of university courses. So obviously they would probably be a little bit more skilled than first-year students. So Class C, D, and E were taught by the main researcher, and Class F was taught by an outside teacher. So there are 2 teachers in total. So we used a questionnaire that was used to rate the closeness between the participants. The participants would all fill out this questionnaire by themselves. They would rate each one of their classmates on a scale of 1 to 5. This scale was based on Popovic's scale of perceived interpersonal closeness. It's a scale that is used between those when looking at the relationship between 2 people in clinical trials in psychology. But in our case, we're just looking at relationships between students in a classroom. So you can see the descriptions and the levels and the Japanese translations that that we gave the students when they're filling out the questionnaire. So they rate each one of their classmates according to this scale. So to summarize the data in the research, there were 212 messages, 6,914 words analyzed in total, and the unit that we used was hedges per 100 words. This was a unit used by Chen in one of her studies on academic writing hedges, hedges found in academic writing, I should say. And it's a very good way to look at the density of how many hedges are within words. And so if you're just to look at hedges without consideration of how many words are around them, it's not a very accurate way of looking at how many hedges occur within a statement. So for example, if you have 2 hedges within 1,000 words, that's not many, versus 2 words within just 5 words, for example. That's quite a lot. And so it's very important to consider density when it comes to hedges, because if you're only counting how many hedges there are without consideration of how many words there are around them, it's not an accurate way of looking at how many hedges, or what is the ratio of hedges to the words around them. So when we were looking at the data, so these are 2 examples of what we are marking the messages with. We first obviously marked what topics that each person was replying to. So the names, and also, so for example, Ayatahana, these are all aliases. Shuji made sure to state who sent the message and who it was directed towards. So for example, the first one is Aya sending a message to Hana. The second one is Shuji sending a message to Nana, and the respective topics are also written on top in italics. What is written in blue and green and red are what we had to mark. So marked whether it's disagreement or agreement. So not disagreement, non-agreement or agreement. Closeness level, so 3 and 5 here, and how many hedges there were. So hedges are written in red. You can see I don't think, not good, and I think in their respective areas. So these are all things that we had to mark and then later calculated once we had analyzed all the messages. So these are the results regarding each one of the classes, and you can see from the chart that there is quite a mix of results. There were pretty different results between the classes before we set them out into the means. You can see that for class C that there is more hedge use for those statements that are in non-agreement. There's more hedge use in non-agreement for class E. However, this trend was not the case for class D, where there's almost identical hedge use between the two, and class F, where it was the opposite. And so we have to look at the means in order to really look at what is the real situation going on here. So when we look at the means, we separate them into 3 different types. The first one is the overall mean, which is essentially no separation between any of them. So it's just consideration of the total. And so you can see that there is a little bit more in the non-agreement. The next one is similar level means, so class C and D, because they're pretty similar levels. You can see that there is a lot more of a difference for this particular separation in non-agreement. And so we're looking at same teacher mean, you can also see that there is a quite larger difference between agreement and non-agreement, with more favoring non-agreement. And you can see in the total standard deviations that there's least difference between the data for classes that are of similar levels. So this is kind of expected. Those participants who come from a similar level background typically will produce language that is similar, because they might have gone through courses that are very similar, might produce the same writing as well. And so that was a little bit expected. But generally speaking, you could see a trend that within the means that there is more in non-agreement. So when we looked at closeness, this was another one. You could see that there's actually a lot more leaning towards one direction. In fact, there's a lot more hedge use in statements that were directed towards distant interactants. And so in fact, for class C, there is absolutely no hedge use between those who are close, rating 1 to 2, and for distant, a lot more for 3 to 5. And you can see that for almost every single class except for class D, that there was more hedge use between those who are distant. So we did the same meaning separation for this particular analysis as well. You can see that for each one of these, that there is a very, very high leaning towards a greater rate of hedge use in statements directed towards those who are distant. And so you can see the respective standard deviations. Again, similar level has the least standard deviation, so data was the most similar there. And you can see from this trend, there's just simply a lot more hedge use between those who are distant. So just to discuss some of the results regarding non-agreement. So the effect of non-agreement was it varied quite a bit between the individual classes. However, the means suggested that there's a slightly greater rate of hedge use in non-agreement. So statements that have any element of disagreement might perhaps have a lot more hedge use. Particularly C and E exhibited more hedge use in responses that expressed non-agreement. And so even though D and F did not necessarily show this trend, when looking at the means, we found this to be the case. So when we looked at effective closeness, we found a much higher rate of hedge use in between distant interactants. And the data coming from the individual classes also matched this. When looking at the case of class C, which is a good way to look at a very extreme case, close interactions employed no hedges towards each other. And so in this sense, close interactions felt even closer perhaps towards those who are slightly close when they were surrounded by those who they perceived as distant. So because most of the interactions were distant with one another, those who were close with one another, so between 1 and 2 rating, might have felt a lot more close with one another in this type of sense. So this kind of elevated their sense of closeness with one another, which reduced their use of politeness strategies. So experiencing this heightened sense of closeness, if I were to draw an analogy, is if you were to walk into a event and you only know one person, but you just only know each other a little bit. Like maybe you've talked with one another one or two times, but you're not exactly very close. But the fact that everyone else is a stranger means that the two of you might feel much more close in that situation. And so that kind of phenomenon might actually be the case in class C and also in other classes where you have majority strangers, and those who are close might feel even more close. So in essence, if you have a population that is very distant, those who are closer with one another, ergo not as distant, might feel very close with one another. So the use of so this comes to the conclusion that the use of hedges might also be affected by how close interactions feel towards the group and not just towards individual people. And so there is a deep complexity within this that talks about not just closeness between one-to-one interactions, but actually between one to the group in consideration of this entire picture. So these are my other works on online discussion. If you're interested in looking at them, please feel free to. And this is about bibliography. So if you want to look at any of the sources that were listed in this presentation, please feel free to do so. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present to everyone. It has definitely been an honor to talk about my research in this regard. So thank you very much, and I'm open to any questions anytime. Okay, thank you very much.